Midday, 1470 BC. The air in the southern desert does not move. It vibrates. It tastes of granite dust. It smells of burnt copper and the sour sweat of 1,000 men. The sun here isn't just a light source. It is a physical weight, pressing down on the back of the neck, heating the bedrock until it is hot enough to blister human skin. In most places, history is written by the victors. It is recorded in the soaring columns of Karnak, the golden masks of the Valley of the Kings, and the polished limestone that still gleams in the Cairo sun. We are used to looking at the success stories. We stand in the piazzas of Rome or the squares of Istanbul, neck craned back, marveling at the Egyptian obelisks that pierced the sky for 3 millennia. They are perfect, symmetrical, eternal. But here, in the northern quarries of Aswan, there is no perfection. There is only silence. And it is a heavy silence. Lying at our feet is the largest single piece of stone ever worked by human hands. It is known simply as the Unfinished Obelisk. But that name is too clinical. It implies a pause. It implies that perhaps tomorrow the workers might return. They will not. This is not a monument. It is a tomb for an idea. To understand the scale of this failure, you have to look at the numbers. They are terrifying. The stone measures 42 meters in length. That is a 14-story skyscraper, laid on its side. If it were standing today, it would tower over the Lateran obelisk in Rome, the current record holder, by nearly 10 meters. But height is vanity. The true horror of this object is its mass. 1,200 tons. Let's break that down. A modern diesel locomotive weighs about 200 tons. This single block of pink granite is equal to 6 locomotives welded together. It is heavier than the entire steel framework of the Eiffel Tower's first platform. And it is 3 times heavier than any stone the Egyptians ever successfully moved. 3 times. This wasn't just a step forward in engineering. It was a leap off a cliff. And that is the paradox. We look at the pyramids and we see the triumph of organization. We see the final product. We don't see the failures. But here, the failure is the only thing left. Walk the perimeter. Look down into the trench that surrounds the beast. It is a narrow, claustrophobic wound in the earth, barely 2.5 feet wide. It was dug not by machines, but by human joints and cartilage. This site was a machine that ran on grain, water, and pain. For months, perhaps years, this quarry was the loudest place on earth. The sound of dolerite balls pounding against granite, a rhythmic, deafening clatter, would have echoed off the canyon walls from sunrise to sunset. Think of the logistics required to keep that noise going. The ledger of this project must have been a nightmare for the royal scribes. Every day, thousands of gallons of water had to be hauled from the Nile, carried up the scorching banks in clay jars to keep the workers from dying of heatstroke. Every day, flotillas of barges arrived from the north, heavy with wheat and barley to bake the bread and brew the thick, nutritious beer that served as the fuel for this human engine. The cost was astronomical. The royal treasury was pouring gold, silver, and grain into this hole in the ground. They were betting the solvency of the season on this one stone. It was an investment of epic proportions. And it failed. That is what makes the air here feel so heavy. You are looking at a bad debt, a catastrophic loss of capital. Imagine the day the silence fell, the moment the rhythm stopped. It wasn't a slow decline. It was instantaneous. A crack. A sharp, sickening pop that rang out louder than the hammers. A fissure appeared in the granite, running through the upper section of the shaft. In that singular second, the value of this object went from priceless to zero. The millions of loaves of bread eaten, wasted. The thousands of copper chisels blunted and reforged, wasted. The lives of men who breathed in the silica dust until their lungs turned to stone, wasted. The machine stopped. The water carriers put down their jars. The scribes closed their ledgers. The site was abandoned, leaving the great Leviathan still attached to the bedrock, fused to the womb of the earth, unable to be born. The wind has scrubbed the site clean over the last 3,000 years. The wooden cranes are gone. The ropes have rotted to dust. The bones of the workers are buried in the drift. But the stone remains. It lies there, stripped of its gold, stripped of its hieroglyphs, stripped of its purpose. It is raw and ugly. It is a frozen scream of ambition that exceeded ability. Most tourists come here, snap a photo and say, "Wow, it's big." But we aren't here for the size. We are here for the struggle. We are here to look into the trenches and see the fingerprints of the invisible hands that tried to do the impossible. We are here to ask the question that the silence screams at us. How were they going to move it? And more importantly, what kind of desperation drove them to try? This is the story of the unfinished obelisk. It is not a story of glory. It is a story of the limits of human will. The visionary, the God's wife. To understand the machine, you have to understand the operator. And the operator of this machine was not a man. The year is approximately 1475 BC. The 18th dynasty is at its zenith. The empire stretches from the cataracts of the Nile in the south deep into the Levant in the north. Gold is flowing into Thebes like water. But inside the palace, the air is thin. It is suffocating. Hatshepsut sits on the Horus throne. She is not merely a queen regent. She has declared herself pharaoh. She wears the Nemes headcloth. In statues, she orders the sculptors to carve a false beard on her chin. She refers to herself as he. But titles are cheap. Ink on papyrus can be burned. Spoken words fade. Hatshepsut knows the brutal truth of Egyptian politics. Legitimacy is not given. It is built. If you are a woman occupying a seat designed for a man, you do not just need to govern. You need to dominate. You need to scream your power so loudly that the gods themselves have no choice but to listen. And in ancient Egypt, you scream with stone. This is the psychology behind the unfinished obelisk. It wasn't an art project. It was a weapon. Hatshepsut was fighting a war of perception. Her stepson, Thutmose III, was growing up in the wings, waiting for her to stumble. The priesthood of Ammonius held immense sway over the populace. She needed to buy them. She needed to awe them. So she opened the checkbook. We have to look at the economics of her reign. She didn't launch military campaigns to loot foreign cities. She launched trade expeditions. She sent fleets to the land of Punt, bringing back mertries, ivory, and gold. The treasury was full. But money sitting in a vault does nothing for a pharaoh's soul. It has to be converted into Ma'at, cosmic order. She calls for her architect, the man behind the curtain, Senenmut. Senenmut is the great steward of Ammonius. He is the invisible hand. He is the man who translates the queen's dreams into logistical nightmares. He stands in the cool shadows of the palace, unrolling the papyrus scrolls. He listens as Hatshepsut outlines the vision. She doesn't want another temple pylon. She doesn't want a statue. She wants a tekenu, an obelisk, but not just any obelisk. She has already raised 2 great obelisks at Karnak. They were massive, nearly 30 meters tall, weighing over 300 tons each. For any other ruler, that would be enough. A lifetime achievement. For Hatshepsut, it was a warm-up. She tells Senenmut that the next one must dwarf them. It must be a shard of the sun itself. She demands 42 meters. She demands a single block of stone so large that it will make the pyramids of Giza look like piles of rubble. Senenmut, the engineer, must have felt the blood drain from his face. He knows the math. He knows the geology. He knows that the quarries in Aswan produce the finest granite in the world. But he also knows that granite has a breaking point. And he knows that the current technology, sledges, ropes, copper chisels, has a limit. A 300-ton block? Difficult but manageable. A 1,200-ton block? That is theoretical. That is science fiction. But you do not say no to a god king. Especially one who feels the pressure of history breathing down her neck. So the machine begins to turn. The order leaves Thebes. It travels up the Nile. It is not just a request. It is a mobilization order. The math of survival kicks in. Taxes are levied. Not in coin but in grain. The granaries are unlocked. To build this stone, the state must budget for an army of workers. We are talking about feeding 3,000 men every day for perhaps 2 years. That is over 2 million rations. The logistical tail is immense. Orders are sent to the copper mines in the Sinai. Increase production. The masons will need thousands of chisels. Orders are sent to the rope makers in the delta. We need cables thicker than a man's waist. Orders are sent to the timber merchants in Lebanon. We need cedar. Massive beams. Enough to build a sledge the size of a ship. Hatshepsut is spending the empire's surplus on a gamble. If Senenmut succeeds, she is immortal. The obelisk will stand in Karnak, covered in electrum, blinding the people with her glory. It will prove that Ammonius loves her more than any man who came before. If he fails, it is a colossal waste of state resources. It is a sign of weakness. It suggests the gods have rejected her offering. The pressure on Senenmut is crushing. He is not just managing a construction site. He is managing the queen's ego and the stability of the throne. He travels south to Aswan. He walks the granite ridges, looking for a vein of stone pure enough, long enough, and deep enough to hold the dream. He finds it in the northern quarry, a massive spine of bedrock. Perfect, flawless. He marks the perimeter with red ochre paint. He outlines the shape of the giant. And in that moment, he signs the warrant for the labor of thousands of men. The vision is set. The money is allocated. The political necessity is absolute. Now, the dream must leave the cool, scented halls of the palace and enter the brutal, dusty reality of the quarry. The mind has done its work. Now the flesh must pay the price. The struggle, the flesh and the stone. The red ochre paint is dry. The line is drawn. Senenmut has returned to the shade of his barge. Now the invisible hands arrive. They do not look like the slaves of Hollywood legend. There are no whips here. A whip does not cut granite. These are the elite. The royal stonemasons. They are paid in grain, oil, and linen. They are the middle class of Thebes and Memphis, drafted for the glory of the state. But make no mistake, they are walking into a meat grinder. The workspace is a trench. It is exactly 0.7 meters wide, 27 inches. Stand up. Put your elbows against your ribs. That is your world. For the next year, you do not leave this slot. You stand shoulder to shoulder with the man next to you. You can smell his sweat. You can feel the heat radiating off his skin. The temperature in the quarry at midday hits 45 degrees Celsius. Inside the trench, where the air does not circulate, the rock absorbs the sun and re-radiates it. It is an oven. And then the work begins. There are no chisels here. Not for the heavy removal. Copper is a soft metal, a 3 on the Mohs scale. The granite is a 7. A copper chisel against this bedrock is useless. It would curl up like paper. So they use the only thing harder than the granite. Dolerite. Dolerite is a black volcanic rock. Hard, dense, ugly. It is found in the desert, rounded by eons of wind into balls. They weigh between 4 and 7 kilograms. That's roughly the weight of a bowling ball. The worker bends over. He lifts the stone ball to his waist. He drops it. Crack. He lifts it. He drops it. Crack. There is no swing. There is no leverage. The trench is too narrow. It is pure vertical impact. Now do the math of the human body. A worker lifts 4 kilograms. He drops it 60 times a minute. That is 3,600 impacts an hour. 36,000 impacts in a 10-hour shift. Every time that stone hits the granite, a shock wave travels back up the rock, through the fingers, up the wrists, and into the elbows. Today, we call it hand-arm vibration syndrome, or white finger. It destroys the capillaries, kills the nerves. After a month in the trench, these men would wake up with hands that were numb, clawed, and useless until they were massaged back to life. Their joints would calcify. They were literally pulverizing their own skeletons to shape the pharaoh's stone. But the vibration was the lesser enemy. The true killer was the dust. When you smash quartz-rich granite, you create silica dust. It is microscopic. It is jagged. It hangs in the stagnant air of the trench like a fog. Every breath a mason took was a breath of glass. They didn't have a name for it then. We call it silicosis, the grinder's consumption. The silica enters the lungs and cuts the tissue. The body tries to heal it with scar tissue. The lungs stiffen. Slowly, over months, the worker loses the ability to breathe. He drowns in dry air. Archaeologists have found the cemeteries of these workers. Their spines are fused. Their bones show signs of extreme stress fractures. They were old men at 30. This was the fuel of the machine. It burned men as efficiently as it burned coal. And for what speed? What was the return on this biological investment? Experiments suggest that one worker, pounding with maximum efficiency, could remove roughly 12 cubic centimeters of granite per minute. That means to lower the floor of that trench by just 1 inch, one single inch, took days of continuous rhythmic violence. The organization required to keep this rhythm was military. You cannot have one man stop, or the man behind him waits. They worked in teams, chanting to keep the tempo. Heave, drop, heave, drop, a human metronome echoing off the canyon walls. The logistics of hydration alone were a staggering engineering feat. A human body working in that heat loses over a liter of water an hour. With hundreds of men in the pit, the water boys were the most critical component of the engine. A constant chain of runners, moving clay vessels from the river to the trench, pouring water into the mouths of men who could not stop pounding. If the water stopped, the machine seized. Heat stroke would take a man down in minutes. And in the tight confines of the trench, dragging a dead or unconscious body out was a disruption the schedule could not afford. So they kept the water coming. They kept the grain coming. They kept the dolerite coming. As the trench got deeper, the conditions got worse. The sun disappeared, leaving them in a twilight of gray dust. The noise was trapped, amplifying into a deafening roar. They were carving the obelisk out of the living rock, separating it from the mother stone. They were creating a geometric miracle, perfectly straight lines, sharp corners, smooth faces. But run your hand along the trench wall today. Feels smooth, feels almost polished. That smoothness is the result of millions of brutal impacts. It is the texture of perseverance. The beauty of the unfinished obelisk is deceptive. We admire the ambition. We admire the sheer size. But we must never forget the cost. This stone was bought with the cartilage, the lungs, and the short, painful lives of the men who stood in the trench. They were the gears in Hatshepsut's great machine. And like any machine, when a gear wore out, it was replaced. The machine, the quarry engine. If you pull back the camera, away from the claustrophobic trench, away from the sweating backs of the masons, you see the true scale of the beast. The unfinished obelisk was not an isolated project. It was the heart of a sprawling, roaring industrial complex. We tend to think of ancient construction as a slow, quiet affair. A few men rolling stones in the desert. That is a fantasy. The northern quarry in the 15th century BC was a factory. It was a machine that consumed the resources of an entire empire. The air here was not just filled with dust. It was filled with smoke. Surrounding the central pit were the support camps. This was a city of logistics. To keep 1,000 men working on the stone, you needed 3,000 men keeping them alive. Start with the smithies. While copper chisels were useless against the granite body of the obelisk, they were essential for everything else. They cut the limestone for the ramps. They shaped the wood for the sledges. Hundreds of fires burned day and night. Bellows pumped. Hammers rang against anvils. The smell of charcoal smoke would have hung heavy over the site, mixing with the metallic tang of heated copper. The logistics of the tools alone were a nightmare. A copper chisel blunts after a few dozen strikes against hard limestone. Against the peripheral granite, it curls instantly. The turnover rate was massive. An army of runners moved constantly between the workface and the forges, trading blunted metal for sharp. It was a conveyor belt of destruction and repair. But the true fuel of this machine was not metal. It was wood. And in Egypt, wood is gold. Egypt is a desert. It has palm trees which are fibrous and weak. You cannot lift 1,200 tons with palm wood. You need cedar. Dense, long-fibered, resinous cedar. And that cedar grows in only one place, Lebanon. By the coast of the Mediterranean, over 1,000 miles away. Think of the supply chain. Hatshepsut's trade fleets had to sail north, negotiate with the princes of Byblos, fell the massive trees, drag them to the sea, float them down the coast, drag them across the land bridge to the Nile, and float them south against the current to Aswan. Every beam used in the quarry was an imported luxury item, and they needed forests of it. They were building the sledge. This wasn't a simple wooden pallet. To hold a 1,200-ton load without shattering, the sledge had to be a marvel of nautical engineering. It was a landship, massive runners, cross-braced with joinery that had to be perfect. If the sledge warped by a fraction of an inch under the load, the stone would slide, and the project would end in carnage. Then there were the ropes. You cannot move a mountain with string. You need cables. Cables as thick as a man's thigh, woven from palm fiber or papyrus. Archaeologists have calculated the tensile strength required. To pull this obelisk, assuming a friction coefficient of 0.3, you would need miles of this cabling. The rope walks in the Nile Delta must have been running 24 hours a day, spinning, twisting, coating the fibers in animal fat to prevent rot. These cables were heavy, unmanageable beasts. Just moving the ropes into position required hundreds of men. And what about the road? You cannot drag 1,200 tons over sand. The sledge would sink instantly. You need a causeway. To the south of the obelisk, we find the remains of the great ramps. These were not temporary dirt piles. They were engineered roadways. Millions of mud bricks, dried in the sun, stacked and mortared. They had to be harder than concrete. They were plastered with a layer of slick, wet alluvial mud from the Nile bottom. This was the grease of the machine. The volume of material moved just to build the road rivals the volume of the obelisk itself. We are talking about tons of mud, tons of brick, tons of gypsum. And then, the final piece of the machine, the Nile. The quarry isn't on the riverbank. It's inland. To get the stone to the world had to come to the stone. The engineers timed the project to the rhythm of the flood. They dug canals, massive artificial arteries, leading from the Nile toward the quarry face. They were waiting for the inundation, the annual rise of the river. When the waters rose, the Nile would swell, filling these canals, bringing the heavy lift barges right to the foot of the causeway. These barges were leviathans. We have records of them. Some were nearly 100 meters long. Building them required more Lebanon cedar, more copper, more linen for sails. The entire economy of the 18th dynasty was warped around this single point in the desert. The farmers in the delta growing the flax for the ropes. The miners in Sinai digging the copper. The lumberjacks in Lebanon. The brewers in Thebes. They were all unseen gears in the Aswan machine. The obelisk was the tip of the spear. But the shaft of the spear was a logistical network that spanned the known world. It was a display of organization that rivals the Normandy landings. Hatshepsut wasn't just building a monument. She was proving that she could bend the global economy to her will. The machine was primed. The canal was dug. The sledge was built. The ropes were woven. The ramps were plastered. The cost was astronomical. The burn rate of the treasury was terrifying. All they needed now was for the stone to release. They just needed to cut the final few feet of the underbelly. The machine was screaming at full power, ready to receive its prize. And that is what makes the tragedy so profound. The infrastructure was perfect. The logistics were flawless. The machine worked. It was the raw material that failed. The crisis, the tipping point, the end didn't come with a whimper, came with a gunshot. It is late afternoon. The sun is dipping below the western ridge of the quarry, casting the long, deep trench into shadow. The temperature is finally dropping, but the rock is still radiating the heat of the day. Down in the pit, the rhythm is hypnotic. Bam, bam, bam. They are in the final stage. The most dangerous stage. The undercut. For months, the masons have been tunneling sideways under the belly of the giant. They are detaching it from the bedrock, leaving only a narrow spine of stone running along the center to support the 1,200-ton weight. They are preparing to snap the spine and lower the monster onto the sledge. The stone is screaming. You cannot see it, but you can feel it. The internal tension in a block of granite this size is unimaginable. For millions of years, this rock was compressed by the weight of the mountain above it. When the workers stripped away the overburden, they released that pressure. The stone wants to expand. It wants to breathe, but it is trapped. It is being held in place by its own mass and the bedrock beneath it. The physics are volatile. The quartz crystals inside are vibrating under the stress. And the cost of this tension is mounting. Up in Thebes, the mood is dark. The project is behind schedule. The festival of Sed, the royal jubilee, is approaching. Hatshepsut needs this obelisk to validate her reign. She needs the symbol. The math of survival has turned predatory. The treasury is empty. The grain silos in the south are running low. The scribes are nervous. They calculate the daily burn rate, 3,000 workers. 6,000 liters of beer. 400 new dolerite pounders. Every sunrise costs a fortune. They are gambling everything on the structural integrity of a single vein of pink granite. And then the house wins. It likely happened during a shift change, or perhaps during the cool contraction of the evening. Crack. It is not a crumbling sound. It is a sharp, violent report, like a cannon firing in a canyon. The sound tears through the air, silencing the hammers, silencing the chanting, silencing the birds. The ground shakes. A tremor runs through the soles of the workers' sandals. Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. A foreman, his skin coated in gray dust, scrambles down the northern face of the obelisk. He brings a lamp. He brushes away the grit. And there it is. A fissure. A hairline fracture, running diagonally across the upper third of the shaft. It looks like a thin, black thread. To a layman, it is nothing. To a master mason, it is a death sentence. The crack is not just on the surface. It goes deep. It has compromised the core integrity of the monolith. If they try to lift it now, gravity will take that flaw and tear the stone in half. The 1,200 tons are no longer a single unit. They are two pieces of debris waiting to separate. Imagine the feeling in the pit of that foreman's stomach. He has to send the message up the chain of command. He has to tell the overseer. The overseer has to tell Senenmut. And Senenmut has to tell the pharaoh. The machine grinds to a halt. The water carriers stop. The barges on the Nile drift idly against the current. The fires in the smithies die down. The panic sets in. Can they save it? The engineers scramble. They measure the crack. They check the depth. Maybe they can cut it shorter? If they trim the top, can they salvage a smaller obelisk? They try. We can see the evidence of their desperation. They started to carve new lines. They tried to reshape the tip to bypass the flaw. They spent weeks, perhaps months, trying to rescue the investment. But the geology was merciless. The stress release had triggered a chain reaction. As they worked to salvage the stone, another crack appeared. And another. The granite was rejecting the shape. It was shattering from the inside out. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The asset was toxic. The thousands of tons of copper. The forests of Lebanon cedar. The millions of man-hours. The lives lost to the silica dust. All of it, every single grain of wheat spent, was for nothing. There is no insurance policy for a pharaoh. There is no refund from the earth. The capital is gone. The site transforms instantly from a construction project into a crime scene. The tools are dropped. The dolerite balls are left in the trench. The marks of the chisels are left mid-stroke. It is a dying dream in the truest sense. The ambition of Hatshepsut crashed against the hardness of the Mohs Scale and the brutal reality of tectonic stress. The workers walked away. They went back to their villages, their bodies broken, their lungs filled with dust, with nothing to show for their suffering but a scar in the ground. The unfinished obelisk was left to the desert. The sand began to drift in, filling the trench, covering the mistake. It became a ghost, and for 3,000 years it lay there, a silent testament to the moment the money ran out and the physics took over. It is the ultimate tipping point, the moment human will was crushed by the weight of the world. The adaptation, salvaging the wreckage, the silence following the crack didn't last. It was replaced by a different kind of noise, the noise of desperation. When a corporation faces bankruptcy, it liquidates. It tries to sell the office furniture. It tries to sublease the warehouse. It tries to claw back pennies on the dollar. The Egyptian state was no different. Senenmut and his engineers were staring at a total write-off. The 1,200-ton dream was dead. But the machine was still expensive. The barges were still rented. The 3,000 men were still eating. You cannot simply turn off an industrial complex of this magnitude overnight. So they pivoted. They entered the phase of the adaptation. Walk onto the body of the unfinished obelisk today. Look closely at the surface. You will see something tragic. Etched into the top of the granite, cutting across the original plan, are new lines. Red ochre marks, faded but visible. They are the outlines of smaller obelisks. The logic was cold and mathematical. The engineers calculated that if they couldn't have the 42-meter giant, perhaps they could carve a 30-meter obelisk from the remaining solid section. If not 30, then 20. They were trying to butcher the carcass. The masons were sent back into the trench. But the mood had shifted. The rhythmic chanting of a great crusade was gone. This was now a salvage operation. They were hacking at a corpse. They tried to isolate the good stone from the bad. They cut new trenches into the body of the failed giant. You can see these cuts today, awkward, halting scars that mar the smooth surface. They look frantic. They lack the confidence of the original work. But the geology refused to bargain. The initial fissure wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of a systemic failure. The internal stress of the granite, once released, had shattered the stone's integrity on a molecular level. As the masons pounded out the smaller shapes, new microcracks appeared. The stone was checking. It was crumbling under the hammer. It was the sunk cost fallacy played out in pink granite. They spent weeks, maybe months, throwing good grain after bad, trying to force a victory where there was only defeat. Eventually, the math became undeniable. The cost of labor exceeded the value of the stone. The order finally came down from Thebes. Stop. Not pause. Not reevaluate. Stop. This moment. The abandonment is the most haunting part of the site, because it wasn't a tidy shutdown. It was a retreat. When a modern construction site closes, the cranes are dismantled. The tools are packed away. The site is swept. Here they just dropped everything. Archaeologists have found hundreds of dolerite pounders left in the trenches. Think about that. These were the primary tools of the trade. They were heavy, valuable, hard-won stones brought from the deep desert. And the workers just left them. Why? Because a 7-kilogram rock is heavy. And if you are not getting paid to lift it, you leave it. The workers climbed out of the pit for the last time. They left the wooden wedges in the cracks. They left the ropes coiling in the dust. They left the red ochre pots drying in the sun. The machine was disassembled. The barges were repurposed for other stones. The cedar sledges were likely broken down for timber. Wood was too precious to leave, even if the stone wasn't. The mud brick ramps were left to erode back into the earth. The army of labor dispersed. The masons, with their white lungs and vibrating hands, were reassigned to other quarries, or sent home to die. There was no severance package. There was no memorial for their effort. The unfinished obelisk became a quarry for scraps. In later years, other reckless masons would come and chip away pieces of it for bowls, for statues, for smaller blocks. The giant became a convenient source of loose granite. It was cannibalized, but the bulk of it remained, too heavy to move, too broken to use. It lay there as the sand began to drift in, first covering the trench floor, then the tools, then the lower sections of the stone. The dream of Hatshepsut, the sweat of 3,000 men, the wealth of a trading empire, all of it was slowly buried. The site transformed from a center of industry into a landscape of regret. It became a place where you could see the exact moment human ambition hit the wall. They tried to adapt. They tried to salvage. But in the end, the stone won. The ledger was closed with a massive red line. The silence returned. And this time it lasted for 35 centuries. The legacy, survival through failure, stand on the wooden viewing platform today. Look down. The sun is setting over Aswan. The shadows lengthen, turning the trench into a black void. The granite glows a dull, dying orange. It is beautiful, but it is a beauty born of violence. We have spent the last 30 minutes dissecting a disaster. We have looked at the wasted millions, the broken bodies, the shattered egos. By all conventional metrics, the unfinished obelisk is a failure. It is a mistake. It is a debit on the balance sheet of history. But history has a strange sense of humor, because this failure, this catastrophe, is the only reason we know the truth. Think about the perfect obelisks. The one standing in the Piazza del Popolo in Rome. The one in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. They are flawless. They are smooth. They are finished. And because they are finished, they are silent. They do not tell us how they were made. Their polished surfaces have erased the struggle. They hide the machine. They hide the sweat. We look at them and we invent wild theories. We talk about aliens. We talk about levitation. We talk about lost magic. We do this because the perfection intimidates us. But the unfinished obelisk? It is honest. It is caught in the act. It is a crime scene where the criminal forgot to wipe the fingerprints. Because the stone snapped, the masons dropped their tools. Because they dropped their tools, we found the dolerite pounders. Because they left the trench, we can measure the width of the workspace. We can calculate the strokes per minute. We can reconstruct the calories burned. This broken stone is a Rosetta Stone for engineering. It taught us that the Egyptians didn't just cut rock. They pulverized it. It taught us that they didn't have diamond saws. They had patience and pain. It taught us about the logistics of the ramps, the organization of the labor gangs, and the sheer, bloody-minded determination of the human spirit. Hatshepsut wanted immortality. She wanted to be remembered as the ruler who raised the sun. Ironically, her finished monuments were attacked. Her successor, Thutmose III, tried to erase her from history. He walled up her standing obelisks. He chiseled her name off the temple walls. He tried to delete her, but he couldn't delete this. He couldn't tear down a monument that was never raised. He couldn't deface a stone that was already buried in sand. So the unfinished obelisk survived. It survived the purges. It survived the Romans. It survived the earthquakes. It lay sleeping in the bedrock, holding its secrets safe until we were ready to understand them. In a twist of fate, this failure is now one of the most visited sites in Egypt. Millions of people come here. They don't come to see a god. They come to see the work. They come to see the mark of the chisel, the scoop of the pounder, the evidence of the hand. It reminds us that the ancient Egyptians were not magicians. They were men and women. They were engineers who made bad bets. They were financiers who ran out of money. They were workers who got tired. They were us. The legacy of the unfinished obelisk is not about the stone that was raised. It is about the stone that stayed behind. It stands as a monument to the almost, to the what if. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes our greatest failures endure longer than our greatest successes. The polished granite of Rome will eventually erode. The inscriptions will fade. But the scar in the Aswan bedrock? That will last as long as the earth itself. The machine has stopped. The coal is burnt. The money is spent. But the lesson remains. We build. We break. We fail. And in the debris of our failure, we leave the truest map of who we were. This is the unfinished obelisk, the sleeping Leviathan, the broken spine of the desert, and it is finally finished.